The Inventor and the Tycoon is a story about two improbable friends. A man called Leland Stanford, who was one of the early robber barons in the American West, and a photographer called Eadweard Muybridge, who was an artist. And they did not belong together. They met in an unlikely way, but over a period of 10 years, these two men created, I think, you can argue, some of the culture that we have today, which is the fascination we have with moving images. Every day we wade through a river of motion pictures on our phones, on our computer screens, on our televisions, in movie houses. What is the statistic now? People are spending 8 hours a day in front of a screen. We are screenophilic, if you like. And the kernel that holds these media together is the image in motion. It's the thing that stops us. When an image leaps into motion, we fall silent, we fall into a state of fascination, we are mesmerized, and that state of consciousness continues until the picture stops moving. Well, these two men, Stanford and Muybridge, invented, if you like, the first pictures in motion, the first moving pictures, 130 years ago in California. Let's go to San Francisco, January 1880. Leland Stanford, former governor of the state, the president of the Central Pacific Railroad, the richest man west of the Mississippi, has built a mansion on the top of California Hill. We call it today Nob Hill. At the time they called it California Hill. We call it Nob Hill because of the nabobs, Stanford and his preposterously rich friends, who moved there to build their enormous houses overlooking the city. Stanford's house has 50 rooms. It's 50,000 square feet. It's decorated within an inch of its life with rosewood cabinetry on every wall and murals painted by Italian painters that imitate the frescoes found under the ashes of Pompeii. It's marble statuary, a dining room that can seat 50, ballroom that 300 people can dance in, and 15 live-in servants. 3 people live in this house: Leland Stanford, his wife Jane Lathrop, and their son, Leland Stanford Jr., age 10. January 1880. Stanford has some friends in for a party and a show. He's got a man that he regards as his companion, but also his employee, the artist Eadweard Muybridge. Muybridge and Stanford could not be more different from one another. Muybridge is rail thin. He's got a shock of white hair, a ragged beard down to the middle of his chest. He combs neither his hair nor his beard. He's got beaten up jackets, pants with the strings hanging off the cuffs. He smokes a corncob pipe. Stanford likes to wear formal clothes, even at home. He goes to work in tails. His shoes are shined to mirrors. He wears diamond jewelry. He carries a gold-tipped cane and a silk top hat. They're an unlikely couple. Stanford invites his friends, who are other very rich men and women, who have struck it rich mostly in mining. California and Nevada, of course, are the center of the spraying out of gold and silver that has enriched a handful of mining families. And these guys and women, mostly guys, live on Nob Hill. He invites them in for a show. He invites his friends who are politicians. He invites judges. He invites the governor of New York, who happens to be in town. He sits them down in a room called the Pompeian Room, which is decorated, as I said, to look like one of the old villas in Pompeii, where Muybridge has set up a new apparatus that he wants to show off. It's a projector. Muybridge has built a machine he calls a zoopraxiscope, which can put 30 images in motion on a screen, something that has been done with animated, hand-drawn images, but not with photography. So Stanford has his guests sit down, Muybridge comes in and sets up his machine. But he's an odd person in more than one way. There is the fact that, despite the fact he's an intriguing artist and something of a showman, he's also a murderer. It turns out that Muybridge killed a man, and he's well known throughout the state of California for having done this. There was a notorious trial. And so as he sets up his device, Stanford's guests, no doubt, look at him through squinting eyes, wondering who this character is. He lights up his projector, and suddenly on the screen, horses begin to gallop. And they gallop again, and they gallop again, as though in a kind of repetitive loop. He takes a disc from the machine, puts another disc in, more horses begin to gallop and gallop. The newspapers that write about this night are always, the newspaper writers that wrote about this night and subsequent nights when Muybridge showed off his machine usually said the same thing. They said, there was an astonishing moment when we were in the presence of what appeared to be a living animal. And the only thing lacking was the breath of the horse and the rattle of hooves on the turf. After this moment of astonishment, the party ends. Muybridge goes off. And this is the debut of the motion picture apparatus that he's designed. Now, who are these two guys? Eadweard Muybridge was born in England in 1830. His name was Eadweard Muybridge. He was the son of a family of corn sellers on his father's side, and his mother's family ran barges up and down the Thames River. His town, Kingston, outside of London, was a sleepy village on the Thames, but in Muybridge's youth, the railroad was built out from the city, connecting his town to the capital. This was a sort of astonishing moment when the railroads and telegraphs were being built out from the capitals. Muybridge becomes interested in machines, and people who knew him as a child said he was fascinated with making gadgets. He would build things for his cousins and little trick devices to impress them. Now, he was better off than 8 or 9 of his other 80 or 90% of his peer group, in that they had a nice place to live, but he was not of the class who would get a higher education. At this time, maybe 1 in 100 men, let alone women, were able to go to boarding schools and matriculate at Oxford and Cambridge. So Muybridge went to the local grammar school and followed the typical path for a boy of his stripe. In his mid-teens, he became an apprentice to get a trade. He apprenticed in printing in London at age 16, so it seems. And 3 years later, he was capable enough to get a job with something called the London Printing and Publishing Company as a printmaker and bookseller.